We've all heard someone in our life say, "You do you." Find your truth, live out your truth, because we live in a world where we don't want to argue about anything, we don't want to disagree, and we want to live in kind of this world of no absolutes. Because in some ways, it's easier. Because if I can live one way and think one thing, and I can allow you to do the same thing, we can coexist to some extent without any disagreement. The problem is that our truths eventually do collide. And the thing is that no matter how much we want to say there are no absolutes and there is no truth, there is. There always is truth. There is what really happened. We just may not know what that truth is, and we all have our different perspectives. You see this a lot in arguments all the time, where people have two different sides of the story, and quite often it's somewhere in the middle. But if you have the actual evidence, whether it be video footage or historical documentation or who knows what it is, you can quite often either find the truth or very close to the truth. And so when you can find the truth, it's really helpful because it gives you a standard for which to base your life, or to at least a situation at the very least. And so finding truth is so important. And that doesn't mean that there aren't lots and lots of different areas of debate and some gray areas and some things that we just don't know. But the fact is, there is truth. And so we are going to be starting a new series in the On Mission vlog and podcast today, called Big Questions. And this vlog has always been about what does it mean to follow Jesus and how are we on mission for him. And so if you are a follower of Jesus, my goal is to equip you. So when you face these big questions, you have some answers for people. Because if you're living on mission, it should spark some questions in people's minds, and ask why. And then as they start to get to know what you believe, it probably will spark some more questions in their mind. And so my goal is to equip you as much as possible. And if you're watching this and you're on the fence about Jesus, my goal is to educate you as much as possible, because that's what we talked about last time in episode 12, was we've got to educate ourselves. And so today is the beginning of a series to try to help you educate yourself as much as possible about the Christian faith, but also the big questions that people are quite often faced with in their life. And so the first question that I want to answer and try to kind of get down to that absolute truth, if at all possible, is who is Jesus? This is the most important question for someone who claims to be a Christian. Who is Jesus? And the first thing we have to ask is, did Jesus even exist? Now, if you were to ask me this 5 years ago, I would be like, oh, of course he existed. And in fact, I had never even heard of anyone who questioned Jesus' existence until about 5 years ago. But since then, I've noticed that this is a popular discussion for many people, and a question that many people have. In fact, in England, a recent survey said that over 22% of adults in England don't think Jesus even existed. So this is a question for debate in many places. And so it's one of those things where I met someone just recently, about 2 years ago, who asked that question. Well, how do you even know he existed? And I just was flabbergasted, because there's so much historical evidence of Jesus's existence. And this is a fascinating argument to me, because if you take all of the evidence that's out there, this historical evidence, the ancient documents and reports of Jesus's existence, his life, who he was, you could fill this entire living room up, floor to ceiling, with those documents, maybe even more than that. But there are other people in our history, like Aristotle, for example, that we all just assume exists, and we don't question that at all. But if you take a small coffee table, you can just, in one layer, put it on the coffee table, and you have all of the ancient documents supporting his existence. It just doesn't make sense that we would question the existence of Jesus, but not some of these other historical figures. In fact, there's lots of historical figures like that, and none of them come close to the amount of evidence and documentation of what we have for Jesus Christ. I mean, it just doesn't add up. We don't hold anyone to that same weight or standard. But one of the reasons why people have such a hard time with Jesus existing is because a lot of the evidence comes from writers from a Christian perspective, his followers, the people who claim to follow him as Lord and Savior are quite often the ones who write about him most, even way back in the ancient days. And so that's not totally surprising, but the good news is there are other documents that are out there. For example, Jewish rabbis right around the time of Jesus actually wrote about him. They claimed that he was a magician. They claimed that he was a trickster, leading people astray. The thing is why would they write about him if he didn't exist? It doesn't make any sense. If he didn't exist, they wouldn't need to write about him. There'd be no reason to do that. And if he didn't exist and it was just this idea out there, they could claim that it was totally false. That there never was this Jesus who was supposedly healing people and was crucified and all those different things. But you don't see documentation of that. Instead, you see other documents that support he existed as well. You've got Josephus, the Jewish historian. He's probably the most popular historian that helps prove that Jesus existed. But again, not a Christian, not someone who claimed Jesus was God or the Messiah even, but he said that he existed over and over and over again. Tacitus, a Roman historian, also claimed his existence. They both said that he had followers. They both acknowledged that he was crucified by the Romans. And then, of course, you have other documents like the letter from Pliny the Younger to one of the emperors, Emperor Trajan. And this is where he's talking about Christians themselves, about how they would sing and worship Jesus as if he were a god. And he goes in more into the character of Christians and things like that. But clearly there were people during that time that believed Jesus' existence enough to be worshiping him. The Quran talks about the existence of Jesus. Of course, once you start to see all this, though, you have to start to ask the question, all right, well, did he exist? And to me, it just seems like the overwhelming evidence is there. Like I said before, we don't hold this level of scrutiny up to any other individual in history. And so I think it's extremely hard to argue that Jesus did not exist, at least as a person. So I think if we can all agree that he was an actual historical figure, he was an actual person who walked and lived on this earth, then we have to ask the question, well, if he existed, then who was he? Was he really, what many people say, just a good man with good teachings? You see this all over the place. You see it a lot in America. You see it in other faiths as well. For example, Muslims in the Quran, you see that Jesus is regarded as a prophet, even the Messiah maybe, but he is not God. So he's a great teacher. He's a prophet even, but he's not the Messiah. And then you look at the Jewish thoughts. I've met many Jewish people today who say, oh, he was a great rabbi. He pointed out some of the corruption of the time and the character flaws of the rabbis at that time, but he wasn't God for sure, and he definitely wasn't the Messiah. We're still waiting on him. And so that is a very common argument today. And you see that even by many other people. Many other faith religions out there say, oh yeah, he had some great teaching. Kind of like a guy like Gandhi. You know, nobody thinks Gandhi is God, but Christians do think Jesus is God. They think he's more than just a teacher. And so if that's the argument of people who don't follow him, what is the argument of people who do? Well, I think we can go and look at some of the eyewitness accounts to really kind of decide who Jesus was. And just you take a look at John chapter 8, verse 58. John was one of the disciples who walked and talked with Jesus. So this was a guy who was there with him. This is a first-hand account. Jesus said this, I tell you the truth. Before Abraham was born, I am. Well, that's a connection to a few different things. One, Abraham lived hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus. How could that even be possible? Well, the only way is if he was God. And that reference to I am is also mentioned in the Old Testament as the way God referred to himself when talking to Moses. So this was a very clear thing. He was very clear to the Jewish people who all would have recognized this. He is claiming, I am God, the God that your people have been following for centuries. He's just very clear with that. They would have considered that blasphemy if it weren't true, and that's one of the reasons why he was eventually crucified. Again, in John chapter 10, this is probably the most clear situation. The Jews gathered around him saying in verses 24 through 25, how long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. Jesus answered, I tell you, but you do not believe. And later in verse 30, after kind of going into it, he says, I and the Father are one. Again, very clear situation where he says, I'm the same thing as God the Father. I am God. And so for some people, they're like, oh, well, you've got one book in the Bible. You've got one eyewitness account where that's what he's quoted saying. That may not be true, though. But this is not the only account. In fact, if you go to Mark, Matthew, and Luke, it's in all of those Gospels as well. In fact, Luke chapter 22, verses 67 through 70 says this, If you are the Christ, they asked Jesus, tell us. Jesus answered, If I tell you, you will not believe me, and if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God. They all asked, Are you then the Son of God? He replied, You are right in saying I am. So what he's saying there is, yeah, I am the Son of God. He's making another claim that he is God himself. Now, this is a major problem, though. Because for those who say that he was a good man with good teachings, it doesn't fit. He claimed to be God multiple times. He influenced people over time by that claim as well. And so as a result, he can't be just a good man. He's either crazy, a manipulating liar, or he is God in the flesh, the Messiah who came to this world to save all mankind. So it's got to be one or the other. It can't be that he's just a good man with good teachings. But the Gospels give us more detail about his story, though, too. You know, it says later on that he's betrayed by one of his own followers, that for some money even. He then is put on trial. It's kind of a scam because the leader of the Romans in the town of Jerusalem realizes he's innocent. He puts him up for release, but the people say no. They're convinced by the Jewish religious leaders, and they have him crucified. Pontius Pilate gives in and has them crucified, even though he was an innocent man. He did that so he could die for the sins of mankind. And 3 days later, he comes back to life. Now this is where the rubber meets the road. This is why this question of who is Jesus is so important. You see, anyone can claim to be God. We've seen many cult leaders out there who do that. But if Jesus really died and came back to life, it changes everything. Everything else that's in Scripture, everything else that Jesus says holds so much more weight if he actually came back to life. And we know that his followers not only believe this to be true, but that they actually saw him die and later his resurrected body, or at least that's what their accounts say. This is the most important part of Christianity. And Paul, one of the greatest followers of Jesus of all time, he was probably the greatest missionary or the greatest person who was able to tell other people about Jesus and about his story. He said this in a letter that he wrote to the people of Corinth. All right, in chapter 15, verse 14, he says, And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. The fact of the matter is that if Jesus didn't die and come back to life, it's all a lie. It's worthless. He cannot be a good person with good teachings. If you look at the accounts from the people who followed him, he very clearly claimed to be God. And if he wasn't God, then he's nothing more than a manipulative liar, just like any other cult leader. Or he's crazy. It's one or the other. Like, he cannot be a good teacher and a good person. It's just not possible. Either he was crazy, he was a liar, or he really was the Son of God who came to this earth to save everyone in it. So we will talk more about big questions like this in the episodes to come. Feel free to leave a comment or any questions that you might have about faith, about Christianity, or any other big questions that you've been faced with as you have been on mission for him. Feel free to share this, like it, subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'd love for you to do that as well. I look forward to speaking with all of you again here in a couple weeks.